We continue in our series this morning about being in the midst of crisis. And I think this is probably going to be the next to the last in the series for the moment, at least. As I've said, there are a lot of different examples in Scripture that we could look at, and we could probably spend a year going through all the different examples that are in there. But I think after next week, we'll probably go a little bit different direction, and it'll be one of those things that from time to time I may just throw back an example and add to the series here and there as we go. But we're getting that time of year when I have some other subjects that I like to start trying to cover as we arrive at the close of the year, and just the reminders of Thanksgiving and Christmas and some of those subjects and things that we want to start preparing for. But this morning, we're going to look at one that I've entitled, In the Midst of My Crisis, When I Need Relief from Me. When I'm the storm. When it's not the world necessarily that is assailing me, although in our example, we're going to see that part of it is related or said that Satan is causing this, which I think is accurate. But it's when we allow our own mind to start, in a lot of ways, running away from us or taking us to places that we don't need to hang out and dwell in. And that in itself causes us to find ourselves in this crisis that we're looking for relief from. So as we think about that, the other kind of different thing about this morning's lesson is this is one of those that there's times when God will say, stay in the midst of the storm. And that's not necessarily what we want to hear. And we'll deal with that as we go through this theory or through this lesson. But you might think that as you think about our first two examples that we've looked at, that in each of those, God said, stay in the midst of the storm. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, God let them go right on into the fiery furnace. And yet they were only in there for a very short period of time before the king stands up and says, look, the ones we threw in there, they didn't die. They're unhurt. They're walking around. Bring them back out. Let's see what's going on. We looked at Daniel and being cast into the lion's den. And we think, well, that's being left in the midst of the storm. Well, it was for one night. And I don't mean to make light of those storms or to make them sound like they weren't life-threatening or dangerous storms or things that had to be faced. But in the scheme of comparison to some of the storms that we face in life, they were short-lived. Daniel was cast in there, and ordinarily you would think somebody cast in the lion's den would be left there. After one night, Daniel was brought back out. Today, we're going to look at the story of Paul. We're going to be looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. And we're going to begin with verse 1 to help lay out the context of what Paul is talking about as he begins to present this thought that he is dealing with something that is a more long-running issue in his life. He begins by saying, I must go on boasting. Although there is nothing to be gained, I will go on to visions and revelations from the Lord. I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up to the third heaven. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. And I know that this man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I do not know, but God knows, was caught up to paradise and heard inexpressible things, things that no one is permitted to tell. I will boast about a man like that, but I will not boast about myself except about my weakness. Even if I should choose to boast, I would not be a fool because I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain, so that no one will think more of me than is warranted by what I do or say, or because of these surpassingly great revelations. Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said, my grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul begins talking about the great things that God has shown to him. And when he's talking about this man who was called up to the third heaven, that was Paul. That was part of the training that he went through after Jesus called him on the road to Damascus. Part of when he went away to prepare himself and for God to prepare him, God showing him things and teaching him things in preparation for his apostleship. But he's not wanting to brag about that because he's not trying to make himself out as something greater than what he is. And he's not trying to say, hey, look how special I am or how great I am. He wants to keep the focus on what God has done in his life. And Paul admits in the process of this that there is the potential for him to get that proverbial big head. I can get kind of proud about this. I can get kind of foolish in the efforts to brag about, hey, look what God has shown me. Look what God has told me. I've seen things that I'm not permitted to tell you, so I know things that you don't know. Yeah, this mindset that it's so easy to fall in when we find ourselves in these kind of elevated positions. Now, these things themselves were not the direct reason for the storm to come upon Paul. He describes it as an attack that comes about in order to keep him from being conceited. Something that God is allowing there to keep him level-headed and to keep him from raising himself up in this way. And I can't help but wonder, how often do we get caught up in that type of a mindset when things are going well? The risk of bragging by Paul was that it would have become about him and not about God and God's plan for his life. And I think that same is true for us. We have moments where things are going well, where God is blessing us. Maybe when others are seeing things that we are doing for the cause of Christ, and they're trying to encourage us. They're trying to express gratitude for what we're doing. And we get those pats on the back, and it's easy to begin thinking it's about what I've done. not about what God's done. I think we see an example of that Luke chapter 12 as Jesus shares this parable, and he draws some other conclusions from it, but I think it gives us this same understanding. As he tells the parable about a certain rich man whose ground yielded an abundant harvest. And he goes on to tell us that he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. And then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? He fell into this mindset of, look what I've done. He had a great harvest year. Working on the farm, some years you have really good harvest, some years you don't. You can put the same amount of labor, the same amount of work, the same amount of effort. And this year's one of those examples. In the watermelons, we had a great year. Really great crop. Peanuts, we put in the same type of labor, the same type of efforts. Had the worst crop with that. Maybe one of the worst crops I've ever seen. It's a reminder, just because I'm putting some labor and some effort into it, there's still somebody else that's in control. Somebody else that sends the rains or withholds the rains. Somebody else that deals with all those things that I have absolutely no control of. And so the problem for this man was his crops came in, and it was a year that God was blessing him. But you see, as he goes through his conversation with himself, it was all about, I did this, and this is what I'm going to do for me. That's what Paul was saying. I had the risk of falling into that mindset. God has shown me these things. God has done these miracles through me. God has worked these things in my life. And it would be easy to take the accolades. It would be easy to say, look at who I am and what I've done for the cause of Christ. We fall into that same trap ourselves so often. And even when we're trying not to, sometimes we hear others vocalizing it without reminding them it's not about me, it's about what God's doing. But in Paul's case, Paul says, this is a storm that was, or a thorn in the flesh that was sent by Satan. But we're going to see that it was allowed, and in essence, it was used by God. Now, there's been a lot of discussion through the years about what the thorn in the flesh was for Paul. Many believe it was some sort of a sickness. Some believe it may have been something related to his eyes, maybe something left over from being blinded on the road to Damascus. I don't know about that one, because when God heals, God heals. His eyesight was given back to him. But that one's based on Galatians 4:15, where Paul said, where then is your blessing of me now? I can testify that if you could have done so, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. So some people think that's the thorn in the flesh, that Paul was having an illness, or he was having these eyesight problems, and that he was praying for God to take that away from him. The reality is, we don't know for certain what it was. But as I look at this passage and as I look at the context of what Paul is saying, I have my own theory. And I say that in the strictest terminology of the word theory. It's my thoughts. I can't prove it. I have the theory that Paul was wrestling with his own demons. And by that, I mean the demons of his past. Despite knowing the forgiveness that he had, I know it had to be difficult for Paul to put everything that he had done against the church and against Christ in the past and leave it. Now, how do I know that? I know that part because in my own life, my own mistakes, the things that I've done, I know I struggle to leave them in the past. I know that there are times where when I'm trying to do something for God and Satan wants to drag up and say, oh, but don't you remember when you did this? The total opposite of what you're trying to do now. When you stood for, when you said, when you did something exactly opposite of what you claim to be now and what you're trying to do now. And Satan wants to drag it up and he wants to put it in the forefront of my mind. And he wants me to think you're not forgiven for it. Or you can't go on. You can't move past that. You can't accomplish something else because that's hanging out in your past. I never persecuted the church. I never arrested people and had them put in prison on false charges. I never had people have their life taken because of what I had done. Paul did. He was human like us. If it's difficult for us to set our things aside in the past, I know it had to be difficult for Paul. Now, Paul understood the grace that God was providing as well, or maybe better than anybody. He knew the forgiveness that was found in Christ. He knew that we should be able to let go of the past and not be haunted by it. And yet, as Paul describes this thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan. And as we look at the greater context of this passage, as Paul begins talking about that it is in his weakness, that it is when he faces persecution, that it's when he is derided and is accused of these things, that in those moments, Paul now rejoices for the cause of Christ. It's because he's talking about those things and the possibility of being conceited by those things. And I think Paul's talking about in those moments, Satan's whispering, this is what you did. You deserve to be persecuted in this way. Because this is what you did to those other Christians. But I think Satan was coming at him from more than one front because Paul was also dealing with the Corinthian church here about whether or not he's really an apostle. Whether somehow they have gotten the bad end of the deal because they got for an apostle Paul when other churches had Peter and James and John and the other disciples, the ones who had literally walked every day with Jesus, the ones who were the original apostles, if you will. And so Satan, through his own memories, through that own nagging thoughts, and through these moments when the churches are doubting him. Attacks him in those two ways. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 11 through 13. Paul says, I have made a fool of myself, but you drove me to it. I ought to have been commended by you, for I am not in the least inferior to the super apostles, even though I am not. Paul says, you made me look like a fool because I'm having to brag about this stuff. I'm having to lay down my credentials about who I am that show that I'm really an apostle, and not just an apostle, but an apostle on par, on equal with these that you're lifting up and saying are somehow superior to what I am. I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. How are you inferior to other churches, except that I was never a burden to you? Forgive me if I was wrong. That's in reference to the fact that Paul was a tent maker and earned his living everywhere that he went, instead of collecting money from the churches to pay himself to be able to live on, where the other apostles did. So we see this situation where Paul is dealing with these things, and I'm just, again, this is my theory, and I'm just drawing from the context of what he's talking about here, compared with what I know about our own lives. Again, I know how many times Satan tries to remind me about my past failures. I know how many times he tries to say, have you really been forgiven of that? Or is there something else you need to do? And how many times he tries to make me feel unqualified to stand and preach or to teach a Bible class. How many times he makes me try to feel unqualified to even call myself a Christian. Despite the fact that I know God's grace. Despite the fact that I know God has forgiven me of those things, that it has been dealt with. And so I can picture Paul dealing with that as he talks about, there is this thorn in my flesh, this remembrance that every time I start to do this, this comes up and I have to deal with it again. I have to remind myself again. I have to confront that that's no longer who I am, that is in my past, that I have been forgiven, that I have had grace for that. And I can picture Paul going to God in prayer and saying, God, can this please be the last time that this comes up? Can this please be the last time that I go to work with a congregation and begin establishing, and somebody shows up and says, oh, that's Paul the persecutor. Be careful of him. That's Paul. He'll throw you in prison. He had my cousin put to death. He had my mom put to death. He had what? God, can this please be the last time that this stuff has to surface? There's no shortage of people in this world or in our lives who don't try to play the same role that Satan and those individuals were playing in the life of Paul. Oh, you're a Christian now. I remember back in the day when we were running around and we were drinking and we were doing this and we were doing that. Have you really changed? Was there really forgiveness for that? Paul prays about this, he says, on 3 different occasions. This was not a couple of hours at most in the fire. It was not overnight in the lion's den. This was something Paul was facing day in, day out. Whether it's my theory or whether it was an illness, whichever the case. It was this ongoing battle that he's having to deal with. That is something Paul is wrestling with his own mind and his own body, that is standing in the way, or trying to, of his service to God. And as he prays about it each time, God's answer is the same. My grace is sufficient. I think that answer works very well with my theory of what this is about. Paul, you know that you're forgiven. You know we've dealt with that. I don't need to remove it from you because I've already dealt with it for you. That knowledge is good enough. If somebody's going to raise the issue for time, the knowledge that I've dealt with it is enough. Use it for my glory. When Satan begins to gnaw at your mind about it, remember, I've dealt with it. My grace is sufficient for you. Stay humble. Don't fall into that wanting to be conceited. You let it be that which keeps you grounded in who you are and in who I am. Paul, you're struggling with your past. My grace has dealt with it. It's all that you need. The storm is there for you to use. Don't let it abuse you. Lean on me. Paul, your level of weakness, your failure doesn't matter. My power is displayed even more because of them. It's not the fact that you were Saul the persecutor. It is the fact that I have changed you and you are now Paul the apostle. No one can make that change in you except me. It was not the answer that Paul wanted. What Paul wanted was for God to say, okay, you've dealt with this long enough. I'm going to erase that memory from you. I'm going to take that memory from those around you so they can't drag it up anymore. No longer will anybody know that you were ever that person. That's what Paul wanted. But it was not what he needed. Again, God allowed it so that he could stay humble. So that Paul could arrive at this place where he came to understand how to use those weaknesses and the ways that Satan would try to use them to magnify God even more. Again, verse 10 there, chapter 12. Paul says, that is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness. I don't have to be the strongest Christian. I don't have to be the strongest apostle. I don't have to be listed as your super apostle. Because in my weakness, God is glorified. In my weakness, God's power is seen. He says, I delight in weakness. I delight in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For the more that I am weak, then I am strong. Not because of me, but because in those moments I remember God and His grace. I remember that that is sufficient. The reality is there are going to be those times when God's answer for us is the same. And initially we're going to feel like God's not keeping up with His promise of giving us a way of escape, that He's not, that He's putting more on us than we can bear because He won't take it away. And yet the reality is he's already helped us escape the consequences that matter. The fact that I had to maybe from time to time think about something that I've done in my past, it doesn't make me guilty of it again. It doesn't take away the fact that God's grace has already dealt with the consequences of that sin. But it can be a reminder to, without Christ, I'm nothing. Without what God has done for me, that's where I would be. There are going to be those times when God says, see the storm for what it really is. Don't build it up to be more than it is. Allow it to display my power and to motivate you. Sometimes we just have to realize we are the storm. That our thinking, our mindset, our approach, that's what's turning this into a crisis for us. When God looks at it, it's not a storm. It's something he's already dealt with. When other Christians look at it who know the change that God has worked in our lives, that are on the same page with God, when they look at it, they don't see a storm. They see what God has done. It's only a storm. It's only a crisis for me when I allow it to be a crisis. And just as much as we are sometimes tempted to get into that, want to brag when things are going well, we want to sink in despair when we have these moments. And Satan would love that. I've said before, I really think this is one of Satan's greatest tools against us. He likes to poke that thorn in. He likes to twist it and make it hurt and remind us of who we used to be. So that we begin to forget who God is and what God has accomplished and what God has done in my life already. And what he's trying to do in the future. And Satan wants to whisper, feel how bad the storm is. See how bad this hurts. If it hurts like this, if it's still this fresh in your memory, it can't have been dealt with. That's Satan whispering. That's Satan trying to draw the picture of a storm that is greater than it is. Trying to make out like God hasn't already conquered the storm. And as we begin praying about that storm, as we begin praying about that crisis, God's answer is, my grace is sufficient. I've already dealt with it. Put your focus upon me. It's not easy. It's a challenge. And it's a little bit different for every one of us because the things that we've done in our past are different for every one of us. We've got some things that maybe we have admitted to others are a part of our past, and we've probably got some things that we haven't told anybody that are part of our past. And Satan's going to pick the moments to try to draw it out. And God will continue to whisper, my grace my Jesus, his blood, our forgiveness, our love is enough. Take the storm and use it. Let it be a wind that fills your sails, empowers you on to greater things. That's what Paul was saying he did with it. I delight in weakness. I delight in insults. I delight in hardship. I delight in persecution. I delight in difficulties. For when I am weak, I see how strong God is. This morning, know how mighty your God is. There is not a storm greater than him. There is not a crisis that he can't deal with. There's not a problem that he can't help you out from. And the reality is, it doesn't matter the storm, his grace is sufficient, because his grace will always supply that which is needed for the storm that you're in. If there's some way this morning that we can help you in the midst of your crisis to find the grace of God, let us know how we can help you.